April 22, 1945, the day Berlin finally stopped pretending. Above the ground, the city burned. The streets that once carried parades and triumphs now echoed with the thunder of Soviet artillery. Buildings collapsed like sandcastles under the weight of endless bombardment. Civilians huddled in basements, praying for a miracle that would never come. And beneath this crumbling empire, buried deep under the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler sat in his bunker, pale, trembling, and finally facing the truth he had spent years denying. For months, he had convinced himself that victory could still be snatched from ruin. Fantasies of miracle weapons, phantom divisions, and counterattacks had filled his briefings. But that morning, the illusion shattered. The Soviet armies were closing in from all sides. Berlin was surrounded. His commanders were either dead, captured, or ignoring his orders. Even his most loyal aides could no longer meet his eyes. That afternoon, in a conference room beneath flickering lights, Hitler was told that General Steiner's long-awaited counterattack, his last hope, had never even begun. The mighty army he believed would save him simply didn't exist anymore. And, for the first time, the man who once ruled Europe realized the war was lost. The bunker fell silent. The air was thick with fear and disbelief. Then, witnesses say, Hitler erupted. The myth of the invincible Führer collapsed in a storm of rage, despair, and madness. April 22, 1945, the exact day Hitler knew it was over. 20 feet beneath the ground, the Führerbunker was a world detached from reality. Narrow corridors dripped with condensation. The air was stale, heavy with cigarette smoke and sweat. The rumble of artillery above shook the walls like an approaching earthquake. In this underground maze, Hitler and his remaining inner circle clung to a fantasy of control while the empire disintegrated above them. Every hour, couriers arrived from the front with reports worse than the last. Maps on the conference table were littered with red arrows pushing inexorably toward the center of Berlin. Hitler still demanded updates from armies that no longer existed. The 9th Army. The 12th, Army Group Steiner. In truth, these were ghosts, destroyed or in full retreat. Eva Braun tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, changing clothes, playing gramophone records, hosting tea and candlelight. Secretaries typed until their fingers cramped, recording meaningless orders. Some guards drank heavily, others whispered of escape. Yet, through it all, Hitler refused to leave. "I will not desert Berlin," he told them. "I will fight to the last bullet." But outside those concrete walls, the battle had already been lost. Berlin was collapsing under Soviet fire. The air reeked of smoke, fear, and inevitability. Inside the bunker, the tension built like a pressure cooker. Something was about to break. As the Soviet army encircled Berlin, the front lines ceased to exist. Entire divisions vanished under bombardment. Communications were gone, fuel depleted, ammunition scarce. German soldiers fought from street to street, often reduced to small groups with nothing but rifles and desperation. Hitler's commanders sent desperate radio messages, but most went unanswered. By April 20th, Hitler's birthday, artillery shells from Zhukov's forces had already begun landing in Berlin. The Führer had insisted on holding a ceremony, but even the most loyal generals could not hide the grim truth. When Hitler stepped outside to greet a handful of Hitler Youth soldiers, witnesses noticed how frail he had become. His hands shook uncontrollably. His eyes were hollow. He tried to thank the boys for their bravery, but his voice broke halfway through. 2 days later, the Red Army had pushed within mere kilometers of the bunker. The radio intercepts confirmed it. Soviet troops were in Berlin proper. Still, Hitler refused evacuation. "I will not leave the capital," he insisted. "I will die here." The generals exchanged glances, understanding what that meant. The end wasn't coming. It was already here. On the morning of April 22, 1945, the day began like any other. Maps, reports, false hope. Hitler's adjutants gathered in the Situation Room, waiting for another lecture about Steiner's counterattack, the phantom operation that was supposed to save Berlin. But then a phone call came through. General Jodl answered first, his face draining of color as he listened. The message was clear. Steiner would not attack. His units had been decimated and scattered. There would be no counteroffensive, no relief. Berlin was alone. When Jodl delivered the news, Hitler's expression froze. For a moment he said nothing. Then his voice, once sharp and commanding, cracked with disbelief. "What did you say?" As the reality set in, his composure disintegrated. Witnesses described the moment in chilling detail. He slammed his fists on the table, shouting, trembling, eyes wild. He accused his generals of betrayal, of cowardice, of lying to him. He shouted that the war was lost, that all was ruined. "Everything is lost," he screamed. "The war is lost. But if you think I'll leave Berlin, you're mistaken." Those present, Keitel, Jodl, Krebs, Bergdorf, stood in stunned silence. It was the first time they had ever heard him admit defeat. In that moment, the spell broke. The Führer of legend had become a broken man, raging at ghosts. After the outburst, Hitler staggered back to his private quarters. Witnesses said he appeared aged beyond his years, his face ashen, his gait unsteady. He sank into a chair and muttered, "It's over." The words hung in the air like smoke. For years, Hitler had fed his followers visions of destiny, a 1,000-year Reich, divine victory, unbreakable will. That day, those illusions died in the cold air of the bunker. Even his closest aides could no longer pretend. They avoided his gaze, whispered among themselves, and quietly began making plans to escape. Propaganda. Minister Joseph Goebbels tried to rekindle faith. He spoke of honor, sacrifice, and loyalty until the very end. But even he knew the truth. The orders they sent out, for non-existent divisions for counterattacks that would never come, were no longer commands. They were theater, performed for an audience that had already left. Outside, the thunder of Soviet artillery grew closer. The walls trembled. Inside, the man who once terrified the world sat slumped in silence, staring at the maps that had betrayed him. April 22nd had stripped away every illusion. In the hours that followed, the atmosphere in the bunker changed. The once rigid hierarchy dissolved into chaos. Officers whispered about surrender. Some staff packed their belongings in secret. Eva Braun, calm amid the madness, refused to leave his side. "If you stay, I stay," she told him quietly. Hitler spent most of that day isolated, refusing food, pacing his room in silence. Those who saw him said he looked hollow, muttering to himself about betrayal. He blamed everyone, his generals, the SS, even the German people. "They were not worthy of me," he said bitterly. It was no longer the voice of a leader, but of a man lost in delusion and despair. Outside, Berlin's defenders were running out of ammunition. The city had become a ruin. Smoke and fire filled the horizon. Yet within the bunker, Hitler clung to one final act of control. He dictated orders for imaginary armies, signing documents that would never reach their recipients. For the men and women trapped with him, one truth was now undeniable. The Führer's world had ended. They were living inside the ruins of his mind. By the evening of April 22nd, Hitler was no longer giving orders with conviction. His generals noticed it immediately. The tone, the hesitation, the vacant stare. The man who once commanded armies across continents now shuffled between rooms, mumbling about betrayal and destiny. That night, his adjutant, Otto Günsche, found him sitting alone in the map room, staring blankly at a crumpled map of Berlin. "It's finished," he said quietly, almost to himself. "There's no sense in continuing." Then, as if realizing what he had admitted, he straightened up and whispered, "But I will not fall into their hands. Never." For those who served him, it was a terrifying transformation. The myth of the Führer, the unshakable will, had collapsed completely. Only the man remained, frail, paranoid, trapped in a world of failure. The empire he built on fear was gone. All that remained was the bunker, a concrete tomb beneath a dead city. Above ground, Soviet tanks rolled through the suburbs of Berlin. Searchlights swept through smoke. Artillery flashed against the dark sky. But below, in that stale bunker air, it was quiet. Too quiet. Everyone knew they were witnessing the last act of a tragedy that had consumed millions. Despite his despair, fragments of delusion still clung to him. The next morning, Hitler summoned Field Marshal Keitel and General Jodl for yet another meeting. He demanded they contact General Wenck of the 12th Army, an army that was fighting west of Berlin, and order him to turn around and relieve the city. Keitel, exhausted and pale, hesitated. He knew it was impossible. The 12th Army was already retreating from the Americans, but none of them dared to contradict Hitler openly. They repeated his fantasy as if it were fact. Yes, my Führer, Wenck will attack. In reality, Wenck had neither the strength nor the will to fight through Soviet lines. But Hitler seized on this illusion like a drowning man clings to driftwood. He ordered his secretaries to record the plan. He paced with sudden energy, muttering, "Wenck will come. He must come." It was a tragic echo of the old propaganda, the promise of salvation from nowhere. Everyone in that room knew it was hopeless. Yet they nodded in silence, pretending to believe, if only to postpone the inevitable collapse. The bunker lights flickered again as Soviet shells landed nearby. The walls trembled. Hitler didn't flinch. He was already beyond fear, trapped between denial and doom. Outside, Berlin had become a nightmare. Streets were rivers of rubble. The air was filled with ash and the smell of burning oil. Civilians darted between ruined buildings, clutching what little they had left. Soviet artillery pounded the city day and night. Still, the Nazi propaganda machine churned out messages of heroic resistance. Radio broadcasts urged citizens to fight to the last. But by now, even the most devoted listeners could hear the desperation in the voices. There was no Fortress Berlin, only ruins and terrified people. In some neighborhoods, children in Hitler Youth uniforms fought with Panzerfausts against Soviet tanks. They were brave, but it was senseless. The Red Army advanced methodically, block by block, crushing all resistance. German soldiers surrendered in groups, hands shaking, faces blank from exhaustion. And deep below them, in the Führerbunker, the man who started it all refused to face the city he had condemned. He never saw the suffering above ground, never witnessed the faces of his people. His world had shrunk to concrete walls, flickering lights and the sound of his own delusions echoing in the dark. By April 24th, the bunker had become its own distorted universe. Outside, messages stopped coming. Telephones were silent. Hitler's staff knew the Soviets were less than a mile away. Every explosion above sounded closer. Yet life in the bunker continued in eerie routine. Meals served, orders typed. Tea brewed for Eva Braun. Witnesses later described the atmosphere as detached from reality. Goebbels rehearsed speeches no one would hear. Martin Bormann still signed documents as Reichsleiter, even though the Reich no longer existed. The secretaries laughed nervously at old jokes, their smiles fading quickly. Hitler's health was deteriorating fast. His hands trembled uncontrollably. He often held them behind his back to hide the shaking. He complained of stomach pains, headaches, and dizziness. Sleep came in short bursts broken by nightmares. Still, he refused to leave. "I cannot abandon the capital," he said. It would be cowardice, but even loyalty was eroding. Officers whispered about surrender. Some quietly slipped away under cover of darkness. The walls were closing in, literally and figuratively. The end was no longer a distant threat. It was coming down the stairs. While chaos consumed the bunker, Eva Braun remained strangely calm. She had refused all chances to flee, insisting she would not live in a world without him. She wore elegant dresses, styled her hair, and tried to bring a sense of normalcy into the madness. "We must keep appearances," she told one of the secretaries. She organized small gatherings, playing music on a phonograph. Old waltzes, soft and distant under the rumble of artillery. At times, the sound of bombs mixed with laughter and the clinking of glasses. It was surreal, like a ghostly ballroom at the end of the world. For Hitler, Eva's presence became one of the few remaining comforts. He spoke gently to her, almost tenderly, in stark contrast to the rage he directed at his generals. She never questioned him, never challenged his illusions. In a bunker filled with despair, she provided a fragile illusion of calm, a reminder of the world before the collapse. But even she knew the truth. The walls trembled more each night. The air grew thicker. Outside, the Soviets were closing in from every direction. Their end was sealed, and she had accepted it. By April 25th, all communication with the outside world had broken down. The last radio messages from German units near Berlin were desperate pleas for ammunition and fuel, neither of which existed anymore. The Red Army now surrounded the city completely. Hitler called for his generals one last time. The scene was grim. Faces pale, uniforms wrinkled, eyes hollow. He ordered them to hold Berlin to the last man, even though most of the city was already lost. He spoke of sacrifice, of dying with honor. It was no longer strategy. It was delusion turned ritual. After the meeting, Hitler retreated to his private quarters and dictated his final will and political testament. He blamed the Jews for the war, denounced his own generals as traitors, and named Admiral Dönitz as his successor. It was a strange mixture of denial and finality, the last attempt to control his legacy as everything collapsed around him. He then told his staff that anyone who wished to leave could do so. Some took the offer immediately. Others stayed out of fear or loyalty. But everyone knew the man who once ruled Europe was preparing for the end. By April 27th, Soviet troops had reached within a few hundred meters of the bunker. The sounds of battle were deafening. Explosions shook dust from the ceilings. The Reich Chancellery Garden, once pristine, was now a cratered wasteland. Fires burned uncontrolled, turning the night sky red. Berlin was dying. Civilians emerged from cellars, dazed and starving. Women carried white flags made from bedsheets. Soldiers who once vowed to fight to the end now threw down their weapons. Soviet troops moved methodically through the ruins, house by house, while snipers traded shots in the rubble. Inside the bunker, the claustrophobic calm was unbearable. Hitler had stopped giving meaningful orders. He spent hours in silence, occasionally speaking of his betrayed people and the inevitability of death. The secretaries noticed how small he looked now. His back hunched, shoulders narrow, eyes sunken. When told that Heinrich Himmler had attempted secret surrender negotiations with the Allies, Hitler's rage flared one last time. "Treason!" he screamed, but even anger couldn't hide what was written on his face. Fear. For the first time, it was visible. On the evening of April 29th, Hitler gathered his remaining staff for a final briefing. He was calm now, unnervingly so. The rage had burned out, leaving only resignation. He spoke softly, thanking those who had remained. "You have been loyal to me until the end," he said. "I thank you." Then he turned to his secretaries and handed each a cyanide capsule. "In case you wish to avoid capture," he said quietly. They took them without hesitation. Afterward, Hitler withdrew with Eva Braun to his private quarters. They had decided to marry that night. In a dimly lit room, as Soviet shells thundered overhead, they exchanged vows before a civil official. Witnesses described it as a strangely peaceful moment amid the chaos. Two people sealing their fate in the shadow of destruction. Later, they held a small reception. There was champagne, and Eva even smiled. But behind those smiles lay the heavy truth. They both knew they would be dead within hours. The next day, April 30th, 1945, the world inside the bunker fell utterly silent. Soviet artillery was less than 500 meters away. Hitler ate a simple meal with his staff, thanked them again, and retired to his quarters with Eva Braun. Around 3:30 p.m., a single gunshot echoed through the bunker. When his aides entered, they found Hitler slumped on the sofa, a pistol in his hand, a bullet wound to his head. Eva lay beside him, having taken cyanide. The man who had plunged the world into war was gone. His body was carried upstairs, doused in petrol, and burned in the garden of the Reich Chancellery, as per his final orders. Soviet shells landed nearby as the flames consumed the last trace of the Führer. For those who witnessed it, there was no triumph, only exhaustion. The nightmare was ending, but the scars it left would last for generations. April 22nd had been the day he realized it was over. April 30 was the day he finally accepted it.